A boy helped an elderly man in a wheelchair under the scorching sun, expecting nothing in return the next day when he knocked on the elderly man's door. He couldn't hold back his tears. The sun was hot, and the street shimmered under the midday heat. James walked barefoot along the dusty road, carrying a crate of small fruits. His feet were darkened with grime. His shirt clung to his back from sweat. He wasn't in school, that wasn't part of the plan today. Instead, his job was to help his mom sell fruit at their small roadside. "Stan James, go on and put the rest of those mangoes out front." His mother called, wiping her brow. Her voice was tired and her eyes had that same worn out. Look, James knew what that meant. Another day of not enough customers, not enough money. "Yes, ma'am?" He replied, moving quickly to put the mangoes where she said his hands were quick and efficient. Even as the sun made his forehead ache, he looked around. It wasn't busy cars rushed by, but hardly anyone was stopping. James scanned the sidewalk across the road and noticed something strange. A man in a wheelchair. The man was old, white, hair sticking out, and his face looked red from the heat. He struggled with his chair, trying to push himself forward while holding on to heavy-looking bags. Nobody paid him any attention, and the wheels of the chair seemed to get stuck on every crack in the sidewalk. James watched, hesitating. He knew his mother was counting on him to help at the stand, but something about the old man made James uneasy. He couldn't shake it. He could hear his mom's voice in his head telling him they couldn't afford any distractions. Still, James put down the crate and stepped onto the road he crossed with careful eyes on the traffic. His bare feet stinging slightly from the burning asphalt as he approached the man, the sound of cars faded into the background. All he could hear was the labored breathing of the man in the wheelchair. Sir? You need some help?" James asked. The old man looked up. His eyes were tired, but there was something in them. Maybe surprise, he paused a moment, then nodded. Yeah, son. These bags are just too much," he admitted, his voice rough. James grabbed the bags, one in each hand. They were heavier than he thought, making his arms strain as he tried to lift them. He slipped them over his shoulders and positioned himself behind the wheelchair. "I'll push you. You tell me where to go," James said. The man nodded again, "Just down to the end of this block." He pointed with a shaky hand. "My place is near there." James started. Pushing it wasn't easy. The wheels squeaked and every crack in the sidewalk made the chair jerk forward. James's feet felt each uneven surface and each step burned from the heat. Below, his muscles tensed, trying to stay balanced with the weight of the bags and the weapon. Effort of pushing the sun beat down on his head, making his vision blur at times. The old man spoke after a while. "What's your name, boy?" he asked, his voice soft under the street noise. "James." He said, his breath slightly labored. "What's yours, Roberto?" the old man said, leaning back in his chair slightly. "Thank you, James." Not many people would stop James. Didn't answer immediately, focused on maneuvering around a dip in the pavement. Finally, he muttered, "It's all right. My mom says we got to help each other." Mr. Roberto was silent after that. They reached the end of the block, and James saw a small building, old and shabby, with a faded door. "This is it," Roberto said, pointing again. James helped maneuver the wheelchair up the slight incline until they reached the door. Roberto fumbled for a key, handing it to James with a shaky hand. "If you could just unlock it," he said. James did, then pushed the door open. He helped Roberto inside, placing the bags just inside the door frame. The apartment smelled of old wood and dust, and James couldn't help but glance around. It was small, dark, and cluttered, but there was something homely about it. Roberto sighed heavily as he settled in his chair. He looked at James, his expression softening. "Thank you, boy. I don't have much, but thank you." James shook his head. "No problem, sir." He felt awkward, not sure if he should stay or leave. He decided on leaving. He nodded at Mr. Roberto, turned, and walked back out into the sunlight. The trip back to his mother's fruit stand felt longer. His feet hurt worse, and the heat felt even more unbearable. Now that he wasn't focused on helping when he arrived, his mother gave him a hard stare, her eyes narrowing. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice edged with worry and frustration. James avoided her gaze. Instead, looking down at his dirty feet, "I was just helping someone." He mumbled. His mother sighed deeply, shaking her head. "James, we don't have time for distractions. We need every second here. If we're going to make it, James nodded, the weight of the day sitting on his shoulders. I know, ma'am. I'm sorry. He moved back to his place, picking up the crate of mangoes once more. His mother didn't say anything more, but the disappointment hung between them. Like the humid air, James tried to focus, tried to ignore the pain in his feet, the hunger gnawing at his stomach, and the exhaustion that made his body heavy. But even as he worked, he couldn't get the image of Mr. Roberto's tired eyes out of his head. The next morning started early. Like always, James woke up to the sound of his siblings squabbling over who got to eat the last piece of bread. He rubbed his eyes and swung his legs off the thin mattress that served as his bed. The room was cramped, the walls bare and worn. His mother was already up boiling some water over the small stove in their makeshift kitchen. James, get up. She called, her voice tired. You need to help me. Get things ready. Yeah, I'm up, ma'am. James responded, dragging himself to his feet. His muscles were sore from the previous day's work, his feet still aching from walking barefoot over the hot pain pavement. He tried to shake off the fatigue. There was too much to do. His mother didn't ask him about yesterday, and James didn't bring it up. Instead, he helped her load the fruit crates onto the old hand cart they used to transport everything. He could feel the tension between them. His mother's silence spoke louder than any words. James knew she was still upset about the delivery he missed and the money they lost because of it. Once they reached their usual spot by the side of the road, James began setting up while his mother arranged the fruit for display. The sun was just rising, but the heat was already building. James worked quickly, trying not to think about the feeling of Mr. Roberto's heavy bags on his shoulders or the way his mom had looked at him when he came back late yesterday. It wasn't long before someone approached their stand. It was one of their regulars, a middle-aged woman who often bought a few mangoes. She gave James a nod before speaking to his mother, mourning. Maria heard your boy was off helping some stranger. Yesterday, the woman said, her voice casual but edged with curiosity. James's mother glanced at her face neutral. Yeah. Well, he thought it was the right thing to do. She said, her tone giving nothing away. The woman shrugged, handing over a few coins for the mangoes. Kind of you, James, she said to him, her tone almost dismissive. But you know, not everyone's got time to be a hero. James didn't respond. He kept his head down, packing the mangoes into a small paper bag and handing it to her. His mother took the money without a word when the woman left. James could feel his mother's eyes on him. He looked up, meeting her gaze. She didn't look angry, just tired. You have to understand, James, she said quietly. We don't have the luxury to do things just because they feel right. We need to survive first. I know, ma'am, James said, swallowing hard. I thought I just wanted to help. His mother sighed, shaking her head. I know you did, son, but we need every coin. You know how things are. James nodded, the guilt heavy in his chest. He wanted to argue, to explain that helping Mr. Roberto had felt like something he needed it to do. But he didn't. He knew it wouldn't change anything. The day dragged on slowly. The heat was relentless, and the customers were few and far between. Every now and then, James would catch someone glancing at him like they were trying to figure out why he'd waste time helping an old man when there were more important things to worry about. It made his stomach twist. By midday, James's mother pulled him aside. We're going to pack up here today, she said. We didn't make much, and there's no point staying out here longer. James nodded silently. He started to pack up the remaining fruits, the weight of the day, and his mother's disappointment settling over him like a heavy blanket as they worked. James noticed a familiar figure approaching from down the street. It was Mr. Roberto, wheeling himself slowly towards them. James felt his heart skip a beat, unsure whether he should be happy, or worried. He looked over at his mother, who had also noticed the old man. She raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Mr. Roberto stopped a few feet away from the stand, giving James a smile. James, he greeted, his voice scratchy but warm. I was hoping I'd find you. Hey, Mr. Roberto, James replied, glancing nervously at his mother. Mr. Roberto looked at her, giving a polite nod. Ma'am. I hope I'm not interrupting anything. His mother's expression softened slightly. No, it's all right. What can we help you with? Mr. Roberto turned back to James. I wanted to thank you again for your help. Yesterday, I know you probably had other things to do, but you made a big difference for me. James shifted uncomfortably. It was nothing, sir. Really? Mr. Roberto shook his head. No, it wasn't nothing. He paused, then added, I was hoping you could come by my place later today. There's something I want to give you. James blinked, caught off guard. Give me what? For Mr. Roberto just smiled. You'll see, just come by when you're done here. James looked at his mother, unsure what to say. She studied Mr. Roberto for a moment, then nodded slightly. You can go, James, but only for a little while, understand. We still have things to do. Yes, ma'am, James said, feeling a mix of relief and confusion. Mr. Roberto nodded at them both. Thank you, ma'am. I won't keep him long. He turned his wheelchair, starting to head back down the road. James watched him. Go, his mother's voice, pulling him back to the present. Go on and finish packing up. We'll head home, and then you can go see him. The walk back to their small home was quiet. James carried the crates, his mother, pushing the empty cart. He could tell she wasn't mad, but there was something in her expression, worry, maybe, or just exhaustion. It made James feel smaller. Somehow, like no matter what he did, it would never be quite enough once they got home. James helped unload the crates, setting everything back in its place. His mother looked at it as he put the last crate down. Be careful, James. I don't know what this man wants, but don't go getting your hopes up, all right? James nodded, though he couldn't deny the small flicker of hope in his chest. I'll be careful, ma'am. He promised with that. He set off, retracing his steps from the day before the streets were quieter. Now the heat making everything seem slower as he walked. James tried not to think too much. He focused on the sound of his feet against the pavement, the distant hum of cars. It was easier that way. Mr. Roberto's house came into view, the small shabby building standing at the corner. James hesitated for just a moment, then knocked on the door. There was a shuffling sound from inside, and after a moment, the door opened. Mr. Roberto smiled when he saw James come in. Come in, he said, wheeling back to give James space to enter. James stepped inside, the familiar smell of dust and old wood filling his nose. Mr. Roberto gestured for him to sit, and James did, perching on a worn-out chair by the small table. Thank you for coming, James. Mr. Roberto said he reached into a drawer and pulled out something wrapped in brown paper. He handed it to James. James looked at the package, then at Mr. Roberto. What is it? He asked, open. It, Mr. Roberto said. Smiling, James unwrapped the paper carefully, revealing a pair of sturdy warning shoes. They weren't new, but they were in good condition. James stared at them, speechless. I noticed you were barefoot. Yesterday, Mr. Roberto said, his voice gentle, figured you could use. They've still got some miles left in them. James felt his throat tighten, an unfamiliar emotion welling up inside him. He looked at Mr. Roberto, trying to find the right words. Thank you, sir. I don't know what to say. Mr. Roberto nodded. You don't need to say anything. James, just know that what you did for me meant a lot, and sometimes people need a little help. James nodded, holding the shoes tightly in his hands. I appreciate it, sir. Really? Mr. Roberto smiled again, the kind of smile that made the lines around his eyes deepen. You're a good kid, James. Don't ever forget that. James swallowed hard, nodding. He stood up, the shoes still in his hands. I should get back my mom? We'll be waiting? Of course, Mr. Roberto said. You take care now. James left the door, closing softly behind him. He looked down at the shoes in his hands, feeling the weight of them. They weren't much, but to James they meant everything. James walked back home with the shoes tucked under his arm, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't sure what he'd say to his mother. Part of him worried she'd be upset, that maybe she'd see the shoes as charity they didn't deserve. But there was another part of him that couldn't help but feel a sliver of happiness. These weren't just any shoes. They were a sign that someone had cared. He reached their small house, the sun starting to dip behind the old rooftops. The air was cooling, but it still clung to the heat of the day. James opened the door and found his mother bent over a pot on the stove. The room smelled of boiling vegetables and something fried. She turned when she heard him back already. She asked, glancing at his hands. Her eyes landed on the shoes, and she paused. What's that? James hesitated, his fingers tightening on the worn leather of the shoes. They're from Mr. Roberto. He said I could have them. He explained. His mother frowned, moving closer. She studied the shoes in his hands, her lips pressed tight. James waited, his shoulders tense. Finally, she sighed. He gave them to you. Yes, ma'am? He said he saw. I didn't have any. James answered quietly for a moment. His mother looked at him, her face a mix of emotions, worry, confusion, maybe even something softer. She took the shoes from him, turning them over in her hands. They look like good shoes, she said finally. Sturdy, James nodded, unsure if he should say anything more. His mother handed the shoes back to him. Her expression softening put them on James. You need them. James smiled, a small, quick smile, and sat down on the floor to slip the shoes on. They fit snugly, the leather worn enough to be comfortable, the cess thick enough that he didn't feel the rough floor beneath him. His mother watched, and when he looked up, she gave him a slight nod. They suit you, she said then, without another word. She turned back to the pot on the stove that night as they sat down to eat. The tension from earlier seemed to lift just a little. James's siblings stared at his new shoes, their eyes wide, one of them. His younger brother leaned over and touched them. You look like you could run faster now, James, he said, grinning. Maybe I can, James said, ruffling his brother's hair. He felt something inside him loosen, a feeling that maybe things could get better. Even if, just by a little bit the next day, James put on his new shoes and helped his mother set up the fruit stand. They were both quieter than usual, but the quiet was comfortable, not heavy like it had been. They worked side by side, arranging the fruit. The early morning, sun casting long shadows across the ground. A few hours in, James heard his name being called from across the street. He turned and saw Mr. Roberto sitting in his wheelchair near the curb. James glanced at his mother, and she gave a small nod. Go on, she said, see what he wants. James crossed the street, his new shoes, making his steps feel lighter. Mr. Roberto smiled as he approached, his eyes crinkling at the edges, mourning. James, he greeted. How do those shoes fit? They're perfect, sir, James said, smiling. Thank you again. Mr. Roberto nodded, pleased, glad to hear it. He hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward a bit in his chair. Listen, James, I was wondering if you could come by my place again later today. There's something else I want to talk to you about. James blinked, surprised. Something else? He asked. Mr. Roberto nodded, his expression. Serious, yeah? I don't want to say too much here, but it's important. Can you come by this afternoon? James paused, unsure. He didn't know what Mr. Roberto could want, but there was something in his eyes, something that made James think he needed to listen. He nodded slowly. All right, sir. I'll come by after I help my mom. Mr. Roberto smiled, relief in his eyes. Thank you, James. I appreciate it. James nodded, then turned and crossed back to his mother. She was watching, her brow furrowed. What did he want? She asked, her voice cautious. He asked if I could come by his place, later said. He wanted to talk about something, James said, shrugging. His mother sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. All right, James, but be careful. Don't go expecting anything you hear. Yes, ma'am, James said, understanding. He knew his mother was trying to protect him, to make sure he didn't get his hopes up about things. That might not come true, but still something about Mr. Roberto's request made James feel like he needed to go. The rest of the morning went by slowly. Customers came and went, most of them giving James a quick glance, then moving on. He kept thinking about what Mr. Roberto had said. His curiosity growing. By the time the afternoon sun began to sink lower, James was ready to go. His mother gave him a tired smile as they packed up. Go on, James, I'll handle the rest. Thanks, ma'am, James said, giving her a quick hug. He turned to start it off toward Mr. Roberto's house, his new shoes scuffing lightly against the pavement. When he reached Mr. Roberto's house, he knocked on the door. It opened almost immediately, and Mr. Roberto wheeled himself back to let James in. The apartment was, as he remembered, slaughtered and smelling of old wood. Sit down, James, Mr. Roberto said, gesturing to the chair by the table. James did as he was told, looking at Mr. Roberto curiously. Mr. Roberto wheeled himself closer, his expression serious. I know you're wondering why I asked you to come here today, he said. James nodded. Yes, sir. I've been thinking about it all morning. Mr. Roberto smiled, but it was a sad smile, James. I wanted to tell you a bit more about myself. He said, I haven't always been like this. I used to have a lot more money, a family, a house that was more than just a couple of rooms, but I lost it. All James listened, his eyes wide. Mr. Roberto's voice was steady, but there was a sadness there, a kind of weight that James recognized. I got sick, and when I couldn't work anymore, everything just fell apart. My family left, and eventually I ended up here alone. Mr. Roberto looked at James, his eyes filled with something raw and vulnerable. But yesterday, when you helped me, it reminded me that there are still good people out there. People who care. James swallowed the words sticking in his throat. I just wanted to help, he said quietly. Mr. Roberto nodded. I know, and that's why I want to help you, James. I see a lot of myself in you, someone who's trying their best, even when the world seems against them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. He held it out to James. James took it, looking at Mr. Roberto questioningly. What's this? He asked. Open it when you get home. Mr. Roberto said, his voice firm. It's for you and your family, just a little something to help out. James looked at the envelope, his heart pounding. He didn't know what to say, sir. I don't know if I can take this, he said, his voice trembling. Mr. Roberto reached out, placing a hand on James's shoulder. You can, James, and you should. Sometimes we all need a little help. There's no shame in that. James looked down at the envelope, then back at Mr. Roberto. He nodded, swallowing hard. Thank you, sir. I don't know how to thank you enough. Mr. Roberto smiled, his eyes soft. You already did, James. You helped me when no one else would. That's enough. James stood, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. I should get back. My mom, she'll want to see this. Mr. Roberto nodded. Take care, James, and remember, you're always welcome here. James left the small apartment, stepping out into the fading sunlight. He looked down at the envelope, a mix of emotions swirling inside him. He wasn't sure what was inside, but he knew one thing, whatever. It meant me more than just money. It meant hope. James walked home, his feet feeling slightly different with each step, cushioned by the new shoes that Mr. Roberto had given him. The envelope in his hand was light, but it felt heavy in another way. He wasn't sure what was inside, and as he approached the small house where he lived, he wondered how his mother would react. He reached their front door, a piece of thin wood held together with nails and faith. He opened it slowly. Peering inside, his mother was at the table, sorting through some old receipts, her face furrowed with concern. The sound of the door made her look up. You're back, she said, putting down the papers. Her eyes moved from his face to the envelope he was carrying. What's that? James stepped inside. Closing the door gently behind him, he walked over to the table and handed her the envelope. Mr. Roberto gave it to me. He said it's for us, for the family. His mother's eyes narrowed, slightly skeptical. She took the envelope and turned it over in her hands, then carefully opened it. James watched her face, trying to read her expression. Her hands paused as she pulled out a small stack of bills. Her eyes widened and she looked at James, her lips parting in surprise. James, there's money here, she whispered, her voice barely audible. James nodded, swallowing hard. He said he wanted to help, that it was for us, so we could have a little easier time. His mother stared at the bills, her fingers trembling slightly. She looked up at James, her eyes glistening. Why would he do this? We don't know him. Why would he give us this? There was confusion in her voice, but also a hint of hope, something James hadn't heard in a long time. James shrugged, sitting down at the table across from her. He said, I reminded him of himself, that he knows what it's like to lose everything. He just wanted to help us. His mother's eyes stayed on the money for a long moment. Then she let out a deep breath, her shoulders slumping. She wiped at her eyes quickly, trying not to let her emotions show. We'll use this to buy food and pay what we owe for the electricity, she said, her voice steadying. She looked at James, a small smile breaking through the lines of worry on her face. This will help us a lot. You did a good thing. James felt something in his chest loosen, a knot he didn't realize he'd been holding. He nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. I'm glad, ma'am. I just wanted to help. His mother reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. Thank you, son. That evening, there was more food on the table than they'd had in a long time. His mother had gone to the small market nearby and bought bread, vegetables, and even a little meat. The smell filled the small kitchen, and James watched as his younger siblings devoured their portions, their eyes wide with delight. James, where did you get those shoes? His sister Mary asked between bites, her mouth full. They were a gift, James said, smiling at her, from someone who wanted to help. Mary looked at the shoes again, her eyes bright. They look like they make you run faster, maybe, James said, chuckling. But I haven't tried yet. His mother watched the exchange, her face softening. She seemed more relaxed tonight. The constant edge of worry fading, at least for a little while. The small house seemed warmer, filled with the sound of his siblings' laughter and the smell of a proper meal. Later after dinner, James helped clean up. His mother washed the plates while he dried them. The simple rhythm giving him a sense of calm when they were done. She looked at him, her eyes serious again. James, I know Mr. Roberto wants to help, but you need to be careful. She said people sometimes offer things, but there's always a risk. You understand? James nodded. Yes, ma'am. I know, but he's different. He just wants to help. He doesn't have anyone, and I think it makes him happy to help us. His mother was silent for a moment. Then she sighed. Maybe you're right. It's just life has taught me to be cautious. But I trust you, James. You have a good heart. Thank you. Ma'am. James said, his chest warming. At her words, he knew how rare it was for his mother to speak like this. It meant she was trying to believe, trying to trust, even if it scared her. The next morning, James woke up early, his new shoes neatly placed beside his mattress. He got dressed and slipped them on, feeling the support beneath his feet, something he wasn't used to. He could hear his mother in the kitchen, and he smelled something cooking. It was strange to wake up to a house that smelled of food. Morning, James said, as he walked into the kitchen. His mother turned and smiled at him. Something soft and rare. Morning. James, I made some eggs. Sit down. Have some before we head out. She said, her voice lighter than he remembered. James sat at the table watching her place a plate in front of him. He picked up his fork, taking a bite. It tasted rich, full, and James felt the warmth spread through him. He ate quietly while savoring each bite. When they were ready, James and his mother loaded up the fruit onto the old hand cart. They walked to their spot by the roadside, setting up just as the sun started climbing in the sky. As they worked, James noticed people glancing at them, at the way his mother was smiling at the new shoes on his feet. Morning. Maria, one of their regular customers, called out, waving as she approached. James's mother greeted her, her voice brighter than usual. Good morning, Susan, she replied, and James could hear a new confidence in her voice. As the day went on, more people came by, some of them looking curiously at James and his mother. It seemed like word had spread about Mr. Roberto's help, and James could feel the difference. People weren't looking at them with pity anymore, at least not as much. There was curiosity, maybe even a little respect in the early afternoon, just as they were packing up to head home. James saw Mr. Roberto again. He was sitting in his wheelchair at the edge of the road watching them. James glanced at his mother, and she nodded. Go on, James. She said, see what he needs. James jogged across the street, his shoes kicking up dust. Mr. Roberto smiled when he saw him, raising a hand in greeting James. He said, how's the family? We're doing good. Sir, thanks to you, James replied. Mr. Roberto nodded, looking pleased. I'm glad to hear it. He paused, looking thoughtful for a moment. Listen, James, I was thinking if you're not too busy later, I could use some help around my place. Just a few things I can't manage myself. James didn't hesitate. Of course, Mr. Roberto, I can come by after we finish here. Mr. Roberto smiled, the line on his face deepening. I appreciate it. James, you've got a good heart. James nodded, feeling a swell of pride in his chest. He watched Mr. Roberto wheel himself back down the street, then turned to help his mother pack up the last of the fruit. Later that afternoon, James made his way back to Mr. Roberto's house. He knocked on the door, and it opened almost immediately. Mr. Roberto gave him a smile, motioning for him to come in. I'm glad you could make it, James, Mr. Roberto said, wheeling himself back into the room. I've got a few things that need fixing. Nothing big, but it's hard to do from this chair. James followed him into the small living room. There was a shelf that had come loose from the wall, a few things that needed organizing, small chores that Mr. Roberto couldn't manage alone. James set to work using the old tools Mr. Roberto had in a drawer. He worked quietly, the sound of the screwdriver and the creak of wood filling the room as he worked. Mr. Roberto watched his expression. Thoughtful. You remind me of myself when I was your age, he said. Suddenly his voice, quiet. James looked up curious. Really? Mr. Roberto nodded. Yeah, I was always trying to help out, always wanting to do something good. Sometimes it worked out. Sometimes it didn't, but it made me who I am. James nodded. Turning back to the shelf, He liked hearing Mr. Roberto talk about his past. It made him feel closer to the old man, like they weren't so different. After all, by the time he finished, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the room. Mr. Roberto looked at the fixed shelf, nodding in approval. Good job. James, you've got a knack for this. Thank you, sir, James said, wiping his hands on his pants. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction, not just from the work, but from being able to help. Mr. Roberto smiled at him, wheeling closer. You're always welcome here. James, don't forget that James nodded, his chest swelling with gratitude. Thank you, sir. As James stepped outside, the air cool on his face, he felt something shift inside him. It wasn't a big change, but it was enough of feeling that maybe, just maybe, things were starting to get better. James walked back home that evening. His thoughts on Mr. Roberto's words, the streetlights, were just flickering on their dim light, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. The shoes Mr. Roberto had given him felt sturdy, each step carrying a sense of security. He wasn't used to his body was tired from the day's work, but his spirit felt lighter when James reached his front door. He hesitated for a moment before pushing it open, inside. His mother was sitting at the table with a small notepad, the one she used to calculate expenses. She looked up as James entered, her tired eyes brightening a little. Hey, James, she said, giving him a smile. How was Mr. Roberto? James sat down his bag near the door and came over to the table, pulling out a chair. He's doing all right? I helped him fix some things around the house. Nothing too big. His mother nodded, setting her pen down. That's good. I'm glad you're making yourself useful over there. She paused, her gaze softening as she looked at him. You know, he didn't have to do what he did for us, giving us that money, those shoes. I think it means he sees something special in you. James looked down at his hands, feeling a warmth in his chest. I don't know, ma'am. I just want to help. He's a good man. His mother reached over, placing her hand on his. And you're a good son. You're doing what you can for this family, and that makes me proud. James smiled, a small but genuine smile that felt like it could carry him through the hardest days. Thank you, ma'am. She let go of his hand, standing up. We should eat. I made something simple, but there's enough for all of us. She motioned to the stove, where a pot sat with a cloth covering it. James could smell the beans and rice, and it made his stomach growl. Sounds perfect, James said, getting up to help set the table. They worked together, laying out plates and cups, and soon his younger siblings came running in, their laughter filling the small space. It was louder than usual in the house that night. Everyone's spirits were lifted. The tension that had hung over them for so long finally loosened just a bit as they ate. James's mother spoke about the plans she had for the coming week, how they could use the money to pay off the most urgent bills, and maybe even buy a few extra things they'd been needing. James listened, watching her face as she spoke. The worry lines that usually carved her features seemed softer, her voice carrying a hint of hope he hadn't heard in a long time. After dinner, James helped clear the table, then walked out into the small yard, needing a moment alone. The air was cooler now, the sun long gone, and the stars were just beginning to peek through the dark sky. He stood there for a while, his eyes on the sky, thinking about how things had changed so quickly, how one act of kindness had shifted the direction of everything. His mother joined him a few minutes later, her arms crossed against the slight chill. She stood beside him, looking up at the sky too. You know, I wasn't sure about you helping Mr. Roberto at first, she said quietly. I was worried it would distract you, that it wouldn't lead to anything good for us. James nodded, not saying anything, but I think maybe I was wrong, she continued. Maybe helping others is what makes us stronger. Maybe it's what keeps us going, even when things are hard. James turned to look at her, surprised by her words. She smiled, a soft and tired smile, but one that held warmth. I just wanted you to know that I'm proud of you, James, for doing what you did, for helping, even when it wasn't easy. Thank you. Ma'am, James said, his voice catching a little. He looked back up at the sky, feeling a knot in his chest slowly unravel. The stars above were bright, and for the first time in a long time, James felt like they were shining just for him. The next morning, James woke early. He slipped out of bed, careful not to wake his younger brothers, who were still curled up on their small mats. He He looked down at his shoes, and a smile spread across his face. He slipped them on, tying the laces tightly before stepping outside. He found his mother in the kitchen, boiling water. "Morning, James," she said without turning around. "Morning, ma'am. Do you need help with anything before I head out to Mr. Roberto?" he asked, stretching his arms above his head. She shook her head, glancing back at him with a smile. "No, go ahead. Just be back before we need to set up the stand." James nodded, stepping out of the house into the early morning light. The neighborhood was quiet, the only sounds coming from the distant hum of cars on the main road and a few birds chirping in the trees. He walked with purpose, his steps steady, and he soon reached Mr. Roberto's place. He knocked on the door, and after a moment, it opened. Mr. Roberto smiled when he saw James. Come in," he said, wheeling back to give him space. "Morning, Mr. Roberto," James greeted, stepping inside. "Morning, James," Mr. Roberto replied. "Glad you could come by. There's a few more things I could use some help with if you don't mind." "Of course, sir," James said, already rolling up his sleeves. Mr. Roberto led him to the small kitchen area. The cupboard door was hanging loosely, one of the hinges almost completely detached. James examined it, nodding. "I can fix this," he said, grabbing the toolbox that Mr. Roberto kept in the corner. As James worked, Mr. Roberto watched him, his expression thoughtful. "You know, James," he said after a while, "I've been thinking. You're a hard worker and you're smart. You could do a lot more than just fixing things around here." James paused, looking over his shoulder at Mr. Roberto. "What do you mean, sir?" Mr. Roberto wheeled closer, his eyes serious. "I mean, I think you have a lot of potential. You could learn more. Do more. You're capable of it." James swallowed, turning back to the hinge he was fixing. "I don't know, sir. I mean, I haven't really thought about anything like that. We've always just focused on getting by." Mr. Roberto nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I know, but maybe it's time to think about what else you can do, what else you want for yourself." James finished tightening the screw, testing the door to make sure it swung smoothly. He stood up, wiping his hands on his pants. "I don't even know where I'd start," he admitted, his voice quiet. Mr. Roberto smiled, a gentle and reassuring smile. "You start by believing you can, and then you take it one step at a time. Just like you helped me, one step at a time." James looked down at his shoes, the shoes Mr. Roberto had given him, and he felt something stir inside him. Maybe Mr. Roberto was right. Maybe there was more he could do, more he could be. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. He had people who believed in him, and maybe that was enough for now. "Thank you, sir," James said, his voice filled with sincerity. "Mr. Knott." Roberto reached out, patting James on the shoulder. "You're a good kid, James, and you've got a bright future ahead of you. Don't ever forget that." James nodded, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He helped Mr. Roberto with a few more small tasks before heading back home. As he walked, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and James felt the warmth on his face. He thought about what Mr. Roberto had said about believing in himself and taking things one step at a time. When he reached home, his mother was already outside, setting up the fruit stand. She looked up when she saw him, a smile on her face. "How is Mr. Roberto?" she asked. "He's doing good," James said, smiling back. He said something that made me think. Maybe there's more. I can do more. I can be his mother. Looked at him, her expression softening. He's right. "You know you're capable of a lot, James." Don't ever doubt that James nodded, his heart swelling with hope. He picked up a crate of fruit, his movements steady and purposeful for the first time in a long time. James felt like the future, held something more than just survival. It held possibility. The morning sun broke over the horizon, casting a soft golden glow on the dusty streets. James woke early, slipping into his new shoes. Almost instinctively, they were still snug, and each time he put them on, he remembered Mr. Roberto's kind gesture, the feeling of hope that had come along with it. He walked into the small kitchen, where his mother was already up heating water on their old stove. The smell of something cooking drifted through the room, a mixture of boiled vegetables and bread, enough to fill their stomachs, at least for breakfast morning. "James," his mother said without looking up, her hands busy arranging plates on the table. "Morning, ma'am," James replied, rubbing sleep from his eyes. He took a deep breath, savoring the comforting scent of food. "Do you need any help before I head over to Mr. Roberto?" His mother shook her head, glancing at him with a smile that seemed lighter than before. "No, son, go on. I'll manage here. Just make sure you're back in time to set up." James nodded. "Yes, ma'am," he said before stepping out into the early morning light. The neighborhood was still waking up, a few doors creaking open, neighbors stepping out to greet the day. It was a quiet time, one of the few moments when the world felt calm before the heat and the work began. He took his usual route toward Mr. Roberto's house, the shoes on his feet making his steps sound heavier against the cracked pavement when he reached the small, familiar building. He knocked softly. The door opened a moment later, and there was Mr. Roberto smiling at him with that same warm expression. "Morning." "James," Mr. Roberto greeted, his voice raspy but kind. "Morning. Mr. Roberto, I'm here to help with whatever you need today." James said. Mr. Roberto wheeled himself back to let James in, nodding as he did. "I appreciate it. James, I've got a few things that need doing. But first, why don't you sit for a moment? I want to talk to you about something." James felt a hint of curiosity rise in him, but he nodded and sat down at the small table in Mr. Roberto's living room. Mr. Roberto wheeled himself, over his face looking thoughtful as he studied James. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about what I said to you. Yesterday, Mr. Roberto began about you having potential and being capable of so much more. I want to help you find a way to do that. James, if you're willing, I'd like to be part of your journey." James blinked, surprised. He wasn't used to people talking to him about potential or journeys. His life had always been about getting through each day, helping his mom, making sure his brothers and sister were okay. "What do you mean, sir?" he asked, his voice quiet. Mr. Roberto smiled. "I mean, I want to help you learn. You're smart, James. You've got the kind of mind that could go places. If you had the right tools, maybe I can teach you a few skills you could use to make a better life for yourself." James hesitated, not sure how to respond. No one had ever offered him something like this before. He'd never imagined anyone would think he could do more than what he was already doing. "But I don't know anything about anything like that," he said. "Finally, I mean, I've never gone to school, at least not in a while." Mr. Roberto nodded, his eyes gentle. "I know, James, but that doesn't mean you can't learn. I've got some old books here, books on fixing things, on how to build and repair. I could teach you, and maybe one day you could use those skills to find better work to help your family even more." James looked at Mr. Roberto, then at the small bookshelf that stood in the corner of the room. It was dusty, filled with old, worn books that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Something in James stirred a kind of excitement mixed with fear. He had always been afraid to hope for more, to believe. There was something else out there for him, but Mr. Roberto's words planted a seed, one that he couldn't ignore. "I'd like that, sir," James said, his voice almost a whisper. "I'd like to learn." Mr. Roberto smiled, a broad, genuine smile that made the lines around his eyes deep and good. "James, that's all I needed to hear." He wheeled himself over to the bookshelf and pulled down one of the books, an old manual with yellowing pages. He handed it to James. "We'll start with this one. It's got a lot of useful stuff, basic tools, how to use them, how to fix things. You can read a bit at home and we'll work on it together when you come by." James took the book carefully, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He opened the first page, the black and white drawings of tools staring back at him. He swallowed, a mix of nerves and excitement bubbling in his chest. "Thank you, sir. I'll do my best." "I know you will, James." Mr. Roberto said, his eyes filled with pride. "You've already shown me that you're capable now. It's just about learning the next steps." James left Mr. Roberto's house that morning with the book tucked under his arm, his heart pounding in his chest. As he walked back home, he felt the shift inside him, a sense that something was changing, that maybe he could be more than just another kid struggling to make it through each day. When he reached the house, his mother was still busy with the morning chores, and his siblings were playing outside, their laughter filling the air. James slipped inside, placing the book carefully under his bed. He wasn't sure how his mother would react to the idea of him spending time learning from Mr. Roberto instead of just helping at the stand, but for now, he wanted to keep it to himself. A small secret, something just for him. They spent the rest of the morning setting up the fruit stand, and business was steady. People came and went, some of them stopping to talk to James and his mother, their eyes curious, but no longer filled with pity. They'd heard about Mr. Roberto's generosity, and there was a shift in the way they looked at James, a hint of respect that hadn't been there before, as they packed up for the day. James's mother turned to him, a question in her eyes. "James, what's that book I saw you carrying earlier, the one from Mr. Roberto?" James looked at her feeling a mixture of nerves and excitement. He pulled the book out from where he'd stashed it under the fruit crates. "It's a manual, ma'am. Mr. Roberto gave it to me. He wants to teach me some skills how to fix things, how to do more than just this." His mother stared at the book, her eyes softening. She reached out and took it from him, flipping through the pages. "Slowly, he wants to teach you," she asked, her voice quiet. "Yes, ma'am." James said he's potential in me. He thinks I could learn that. Maybe I could find better work one day. His mother was silent for a moment, her fingers brushing the pages. Then she looked up at James, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen in a long time. "Hope you think you can do this, James," she asked, her voice steady. James nodded. "Yes, ma'am." "I want to try." She handed the book back to him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Then you do it, James. You take every opportunity you can. I want you to have more than what we have now. Thank you." "Ma'am," James said, his voice filled with emotion. He clutched the book to his chest, feeling a determination grow inside him that evening. After they'd finished dinner, James sat at the small table in their living room, the manual open in front of him. The room was dim, the only light coming from the small bulb that hung above, but it was enough for James to read. He traced his finger along the drawings, the simple diagrams, showing how to use a wrench, how to fix a broken hinge. His younger brother, David, came over and peered at the book, his eyes wide. "What's that, James?" he asked. "It's a book." "Mr. Roberto gave me," James replied. "He's going to teach me how to fix things. Maybe one day I can use what I learned to help us." Even more, David's eyes widened, a smile spreading across his face. "Wow. James, you're going to be like one of those men who can fix anything." "Maybe," James said, ruffling his brother's hair. "But first I've got to learn a lot." David nodded, sitting down beside James to watch him study for the first time. In a long time, James felt like he was doing something that mattered, something that could change things for him, for his family. He wasn't just getting by anymore. He was working towards something more. The night grew late, but James kept reading. The weight of the manual, a reminder of the possibilities ahead. He knew it wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges, but for once, James felt ready. He was tired of just surviving. He was ready to build something better. The morning sun peeked through the cracks in the old wooden window shutters, waking James earlier than usual. He rubbed his eyes slowly, rising from his makeshift mattress. His fingers brushed against the old manual from Mr. Roberto, still open on the floor. Where he'd left it the night before, James could barely remember falling asleep while studying the different tools and their uses. He smiled as he closed the book, tucking it under his bed with care. The house was quiet, his younger siblings were still asleep, and his mother was outside sweeping the front yard. James took the chance to quickly dress, slipping on his shoes, which were now becoming part of his routine. His first taste of security, he stepped outside and found his mother humming softly to herself as she swept the morning. Was cool, a brief relief before the day. Heated up, she looked up when she heard him, her expression softening. "You're up early, James," she said, pausing her sweeping. "I wanted to get a head start." James said, smiling. "Mr. Roberto wants me to help out again today, but I was thinking, maybe I could help some of the neighbors too." His mother looked at him with curiosity, tilting her head. The neighbors, James nodded. "There are a lot of people who need help, ma'am. I think I can do more than just work at the stand or help Mr. Roberto. It feels like maybe I could give back just a little." His mother watched him for a moment, then smiled, pride shining in her eyes. "If you think it's the right thing to do, James, then go ahead. Just remember to be careful." "Yes, ma'am," James said, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He turned and began walking down the road, heading towards the familiar houses that lined the dusty street. He thought about all the times he had seen people struggling, like the elderly woman who carried water from the well every morning, or the man who always seemed to have trouble fixing his old bicycle. James decided to start with Mrs. Thompson, the elderly neighbor who lived a few houses down. He approached her front gate and saw her struggling with a heavy water bucket, her frail arms shaking under its weight. Mrs. Thompson, James called out, jogging over to her. "Let me help you with that." The old woman looked up, surprise flashing across her face. "Oh, James, you don't need to do that," she said, though. Her voice was filled with relief. "It's no problem, Mrs. Thompson," James said, taking the bucket from her. It was heavier than he expected, the water sloshing around, but his grip was firm. He carried it to her doorstep, setting it down gently. "Do you need anything else?" Mrs. Thompson gave him a grateful smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "You're a good boy, James. I don't know how many times I've struggled with that bucket. Thank you." James nodded, feeling a small burst of pride. "You're welcome, ma'am, anytime. You need help, just call for me." He moved on from there, walking further down the street. He found Mr. Lee, the man with the troublesome bicycle, sitting on his front steps, staring at the bike with a frustrated expression. The chain had come loose, and one of the pedals hung at an awkward angle. "Hey, Mr. Lee," James called out, approaching. "Need a hand with that?" Mr. Lee looked up, surprised evident on his face. "James, this old thing has been giving me trouble for days. I wouldn't say no to some help." James crouched down next to the bicycle, his fingers already moving to examine the loose chain. He could hear Mr. Roberto's voice in his head, explaining how chains worked, how to set them back on track. It wasn't perfect, but after a few minutes, James managed to fix it. He looked up at Mr. Lee, a grin spreading across his face. "There you go. Mr. Lee should be good to ride now," James said, standing up and wiping his hands on his pants. Mr. Lee tested the pedal, his face breaking into a wide smile. "Well, I'll be you did it, James." "Thank you. I don't know what I would have done without you," James nodded, feeling a rush of satisfaction. "I'm glad I could help." He continued on, stopping whenever he saw someone who looked like they needed an extra pair of hands carrying groceries, fixing a broken lash, even just helping a mother with her children while she gathered her things. Each act of kindness felt like a step forward, like he was giving back to the community that had always been around him, even if it hadn't always been kind by midday. James was tired but fulfilled. He made his way back to his house to find his mother standing by the fruit stand, waving to someone who had just bought a few mangoes. She looked up and saw James approaching, her eyes softening with affection. "Look at you," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "Helping everyone today." "Are you?" James shrugged, smiling. It just felt like the right thing to do. "Ma'am, I think maybe if we all helped each other a little more, things wouldn't feel so hard all the time." His mother reached over, brushing a hand through his hair. "You're growing into a fine young man. James, your father would have been proud of you." James felt a pang in his chest at the mention of his father, a man who had left years ago in search of work, someone he barely remembered but missed all the same. He nodded, looking down. "Thank you. Ma'am, come on now," his mother said, giving his shoulder a squeeze. "Let's get ready to go. We've got customers to take care of." The rest of the afternoon passed quickly. The fruit stand was busier than usual, with people stopping to talk to James, thanking him for the help he'd offered earlier. Some bought more fruit than they usually did, their smiles warmer, their words more genuine, as they were packing up to leave. James saw Mr. Roberto wheeling himself down the street towards them. His heart lifted at the sight of the old man. He waved, and Mr. Roberto returned the gesture, smiling. "Good afternoon." James Maria Mr. Roberto greeted as he reached the stand. "Good afternoon." Mr. Roberto, James's mother, replied warmly. Mr. Roberto looked at James, his eyes twinkling. "I heard you've been busy today, James, helping all sorts of people." James nodded, a hint of shyness creeping in. "I just wanted to give back, sir, to help others the way you helped me." Mr. Roberto's smile widened, and he nodded approvingly. "That's the spirit, James. That's how we make things better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone around us." James's mother looked at Mr. Roberto, her face softening. "We're grateful for everything you've done for us. You've given James hope, something we haven't had in a long time." Mr. Roberto nodded, his eyes meeting James. "He gave me hope too, Maria. He reminded me that there are still good people in this world willing to help each other." James felt a warmth spread through his chest, his eyes stinging slightly. He looked down, swallowing hard. Thank you, sir, for believing in me. Mr. Roberto reached out, patting James on the shoulder. Always, James, you're a good boy, and I have no doubt that you're going to do great things that night. After they had returned home and settled in for the evening, James sat at the small table once more, his manual open in front of him. His siblings gathered around, curious as ever, and James found himself explaining the tools, pointing to the pictures, and describing what they were used for. David listened with wide eyes, hanging on to every word. And this one, it's called a wrench. James said, pointing to a picture of the tool, you use it to tighten or loosen bolts. It's useful for fixing all sorts of things. David nodded his small face, serious. Can I learn too? James smiled, ruffling his brother's hair. Of course you can, David. I'll teach you everything. I know we'll learn together. The room felt warmer, filled with laughter and curiosity. James looked at his mother, who was watching from the kitchen, her expression soft and proud. He knew they still had a long way to go. There were still bills to pay, struggles to face, but for the first time, James felt like they were no longer just surviving. They were living, even if only a little bit better, as the night grew late and the candles burned down low. James closed the manual, his heart full. He felt the weight of the day's work in his muscles, but he also felt something else, a sense of purpose. A feeling that maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference, not just for his family, but for the people around him. James went to bed that night with a smile on his face, his new shoes neatly placed beside his mattress. They were more than just shoes. They were a reminder that kindness could change things, that hope was worth holding on to. The sun was rising slowly, and the first beams of light slipped through the thin curtains of James's room. He woke up feeling both tired and excited. The memories of yesterday, still fresh in his mind, the neighbor's gratitude, the warmth of helping others, and Mr. Roberto's words of encouragement. James quickly got dressed and slipped into his shoes. The soft creak of the floorboards under his feet was the only sound in the still house. His siblings were still asleep, their soft breathing filling the room. He tiptoed out of the house, careful not to wake anyone, and stepped outside to find the morning air still cool against his skin. He made his way to Mr. Roberto's house, feeling a slight flutter in his chest. Today would be different. Today, Mr. Roberto had promised to teach him more. The lessons weren't just about tools or books anymore. They were about how to approach life, to think about the future. James knocked on Mr. Roberto's door, and soon it opened when Roberto called out his face. Lighting up when he saw James' morning, Mr. Roberto, James replied, stepping inside the apartment, smelled of brewed tea, and there was a warmth that made James feel at home. Mr. Roberto motioned for him to sit, wheeling himself over to the small table. Where a kettle and two mismatched mugs sat, he poured some tea for both of them and handed one mug to James. Got something to share with you today. Mr. Roberto said, his voice softer than usual, his expression thoughtful. He picked up a small tattered notebook from the table and handed it to James. This here is my old journal. Back when I was younger, I used to write down everything, my dreams, my plans, the things I wanted to do, figured it might be time. I pass this on to you. James took the notebook carefully, his fingers brushing against the worn cover. He opened it, the pages yellowed with age, but filled with neat, slanted handwriting. There were sketches of things to build, ideas for inventions, and notes on different mechanical concepts. It was like looking into a part of Mr. Roberto's past, his dreams, his ambitions, sir. This means a lot, James said, his voice barely above a whisper. Are you sure you want me to have this? Mr. Roberto smiled, nodding. I'm sure, James. I've carried those dreams with me long enough now. It's your turn. You've got a bright future ahead of you, but you've got to start thinking about what you want to build, not just for your family, but for yourself. James swallowed, his eyes scanning the words on the page. He looked up at Mr. Roberto, his chest tightening with emotion. Thank you, sir. I won't let you down. I know you won't, James, Mr. Roberto said, his eyes shining with pride. Now let's get started today. I'm going to teach you something more practical, how to repair electrical items. It's a skill. That'll help you get work some, James nodded, eager. He followed Mr. Roberto into the small living area where a broken radio sat on a table. Its wires were exposed and the outer casing was cracked. Mr. Roberto explained each part, taking his time to show James the components and how they work together. He talked about current, about circuits, about how everything had to be connected in just the right way for the radio to come to life. As James listened, he felt something shift inside him. A new kind of excitement, a sense of possibility. He could see the pieces coming together, and for the first time he understood how they fit, how they made something work. "Now give it a try," Mr. Roberto said, leaning back in his wheelchair, watching James carefully picked up the tools. Mr. Roberto handed him his hand, moving over the wires connecting them. As he had been shown, he worked slowly, the world around him fading into the background. All he could hear was Mr. Roberto's quiet guidance, the soft clicks of metal tools against the radio's frame. Finally, he twisted the last wire into place. Then looked up. "Go ahead, turn it on," Mr. Roberto said, a smile playing on his lips. James reached out, his heart pounding slightly as he flicked the small switch on the radio. For a moment, nothing happened, and James felt his chest tighten with disappointment. But then a crackle filled the air, followed by the faint, tiny sound of a voice. The radio had come to life. James's eyes widened, a grin spreading across his face. "It works," he said. Looking up at Mr. Roberto nodded, his smile broadening. "It works because you made it work, James. Remember that feeling, the feeling of making something come to life? That's your talent, your strength." James nodded, his fingers still resting on the radio's knobs. He couldn't stop smiling. It was such a simple thing, but it felt like he had just unlocked something inside himself, something powerful, something that made him feel like he could change things. They spent the rest of the morning working on small items, an old clock, a broken fan, each one a lesson in patience and precision. Mr. Roberto shared stories as they worked, stories about his own youth, about the times when he'd fixed things to earn a living, about how he'd always dreamed of building something greater. Life doesn't always give you what you plan for. Mr. Roberto said at one point, his voice tinged with a hint of sadness, "But that doesn't mean you stop dreaming, doesn't mean you stop trying to make something better for yourself." James nodded, taking in every word he could see, the lines on Mr. Roberto's face, the years of struggle and hardship etched into his skin. But he also saw something else: resilience. Mr. Roberto had faced so much, but he hadn't given up, and neither would James by the bang. Time the sun was high in the sky. It was time for James to head back home to help his mother. With the fruit stand, Mr. Roberto patted his shoulder as he stood to leave. "Remember, James, you're capable of more than you think. Don't ever forget that." "Yes, sir," James said, his voice filled with determination. "Thank you for everything." Mr. Roberto smiled. "You've already thanked me." "James, now go on, and don't forget to keep dreaming." James walked back home, his head held high, the tattered notebook tea under his arm. The weight of it felt comforting, like a reminder of what was possible. As he approached the house, he saw his mother standing by the fruit, her eyes scanning the street when she saw him. She smiled, waving him over. "You're back, James." "How was it today?" James held up the notebook, his grin wide. "Mr. Roberto gave me this, ma'am. It's his old journal. He wants me to learn from it, to think about what I want for my future." His mother looked at the notebook. Her expression softening, she reached out her fingers, brushing the worn cover. "That's a special gift. James, you hold on to that." "I will, ma'am," James promised, his voice steady. They spent the rest of the day at the fruit stand, and James couldn't help but feel different, like he was standing. A little taller, like there was something inside him that had finally begun to grow. He thought about the people he had helped. Yesterday, the look on Mr. Lee's face when his bicycle had been fixed. The way Mrs. Thompson had smiled when James carried her bucket when they returned home that evening. James sat down at the small table, the notebook open in front of him. He traced his fingers over the drawings, over the notes, feeling the weight of Mr. Roberto's dreams. And now his own. David sat beside him, watching with wide eyes. "Can I see too?" David asked, his voice filled with curiosity. James nodded, shifting the notebook so David could see the pages better. "Of course, David, we're going to learn together." "Remember," David smiled, his eyes bright, "I want to be just like you." James felt a lump in his throat at his brother's words. He nodded, his voice catching slightly as he said, "You'll be even better." "David, you'll see," as the night drew on. James kept studying the notebook, David beside him. Their heads bent close together. The room was quiet, except for the soft scratching of the pencil, as James copied down, notes his mind racing with ideas. His mother watched from across the room, her heart swelling with pride. She knew their lives were still tough, that there were many challenges ahead, but for the first time, she felt like there was hope. A real, tangible hope that her children could have more, could be more than what life had handed them. And in that quiet room, under the soft glow of the lamp, James began to dream not just about surviving, but about building a life, about using his hands and his mind to create something better, not just for himself, but for his family, for his community. He looked up at David, who had fallen asleep beside him, and he smiled, brushing a hand over his brother's hair. The road ahead was still long, but James knew one thing. He wasn't walking it alone. He had his family, he had Mr. Roberto, and now he had a dream, and that was more than enough. The early morning sun poured through the small gaps in the window, filling the room with a soft golden glow. James woke up, his body tired, but his spirit light. He turned to see David still asleep. Beside him, his small face calm, the old notebook lay under James's pillow, a reminder of the new journey he'd started. He carefully got up, putting on his shoes, and glanced at his brother before stepping outside. His mother was already up preparing things in the kitchen. She looked up at James as he walked in her eyes, brightening, "Good morning," James ready for another busy day. Yes, ma'am, James," said a small smile on his face. He walked over and grabbed a small loaf of bread, breaking it in half to share with his siblings when they woke. "I thought I'd head over to Mr. Roberto's before we start at the stand." His mother nodded. She knew that the visits to Mr. Roberto had become an important part of James's life, a chance for him to learn to grow. She also knew that it was something James needed, not just for the skills, but for the hope it brought him. All right, but be back in time to help. "Okay, yes, ma'am," James replied, grabbing his notebook before heading out the door. The morning was quiet, the air still cool, as James walked through the familiar streets. A few neighbors waved at him, greeting him with warmth that had become a little more common since the day he'd begun helping around the neighborhood. Morning. James' Mrs. Thompson called out from her doorstep. The same bucket James had helped her carry, now resting by her feet, mourning. "Mrs. Thompson," James called back, waving. It felt good to be known, not as the boy from the poor family, but as someone who could be counted on, someone who made a difference. James reached Mr. Roberto's place and knocked lightly on the door. It opened a moment later, and there was Mr. Roberto smiling as usual. "Morning, James," he said warmly, wheeling himself back to give James space to come. "In morning, Mr. Roberto," James replied, stepping inside. Mr. Roberto gestured for James to sit, then wheeled himself over to the small table where some tools and a broken clock lay. He pointed at the clock, "Thought today we could work on this. Something a bit trickier. It's got a problem with the gears inside. I want you to see if you can figure it out." James nodded eagerly, taking the seat across from Mr. Roberto. He opened his notebook, the pages filled with sketches and notes from their previous lessons. Mr. Roberto handed him a small screwdriver, his eyes filled with pride as he watched James begin to work. "Take your time," Mr. Roberto said gently. "It's not about getting it right quickly. It's about learning, understanding every piece and how it fits." James nodded, "Care why?" Removing the back cover of the clock. His fingers moved steadily, his brow furrowed in concentration as he worked. Mr. Roberto spoke softly, sharing stories from his past about the times when he had worked on clocks. Just like this one, about the life he had once imagined for himself. James listened, his hands busy, his heart full. He could feel the connection between them. Two people from different times, different lives, but bound by the same need to build, to fix, to make something better. "Mr. Roberto," James asked, after a while, his eyes still on the clock. "Yes, James," Mr. Roberto replied, leaning back in his chair. "Do you think one day I could teach others the way you're teaching me?" James looked up, his eyes filled with a kind of hopeful determination. Mr. Roberto smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Of course, James. That's what this is all about. Passing on what you've learned, helping others grow one day. You'll teach others and they'll teach others in turn. That's how we make things better." One person at a time, James nodded, a smile spreading across his face. He felt the weight of the responsibility, but it was a weight he was ready to carry. It was about more than just learning to fix things. It was about creating a ripple, about making a difference that went beyond his own life. They worked together for the next few hours, until finally, James managed to put the clock back together. The gears clicking smoothly into place. He wound it and they both watched as the hands began to move, ticking steadily. Well done. James, Mr. Roberto said, clapping his hands together. You've got a talent. You really do, James beamed, his heart swelling with pride. Thank you, sir. I couldn't have done it without you. Mr. Roberto smiled, shaking his head. You had it in you all along, James. I just helped you see it after their work was done. James said goodbye and promised to return the next day. He walked back to his house, the sun now climbing high into the sky, warming the streets beneath his feet. He felt lighter, like each step was taking him somewhere new, somewhere full of possibility when he reached his house. His mother and siblings were already outside setting up the fruit stand. His mother looked up as he approached, her smile widening. You're just in time, James, ready to help. Yes, ma'am, James said, setting his notebook aside and helping to lift the crates onto the stand. His siblings ran around, their laughter filling the air, and James couldn't help but smile. Things were still hard, though there were still struggles, still bills to pay and mouths to feed, but there was also hope, a sense of purpose that hadn't been there before. As the day went on, more and more neighbors stopped by, some buying fruit, others just stopping to chat. They talked about the small things, the weather, the latest news. But there was also a warmth, a sense of community that had begun to grow since James started helping others. Mr. Lee came by, his vehicle now working smoothly, a smile on his face. James, I've got another favor to ask, he said, his voice almost sheepish, of course. Mr. Lee, what do you need? James asked, his hands still busy stacking fruit. I've got a problem with my front gate, keeps getting stuck. Think you could take a look at it sometime? Mr. Lee asked. James nodded, grinning. Sure thing, Mr. Lee. I'll come by after we close up here. Thanks, James. You're a real help. You know that, Mr. Lee said, clapping James on the shoulder. James smiled, nodding. Just doing what I can. Mr. Lee, the afternoon passed quickly, filled with laughter, work, and a sense of purpose that made even the small tasks feel meaningful. By the time they packed up for the day, James felt a sense of satisfaction that was more than just the result of a good day's work. It was the satisfaction of knowing that he was making a difference, not just for himself, but for those around him as they walked back to their small house. His mother looked over at James, her expression soft. You know, James, I've seen a real change in you lately. You seem lighter, happier. James nodded, looking down at his shoes as they walked. I think it's because I'm not just getting by anymore, ma'am. I'm doing something that matters. Mr. Roberto has taught me so much, and now I feel like I can do more, not just for us, but for the whole neighborhood. His mother smiled, her eyes filled with pride. You're a good boy, James, and you're gonna make a difference. I just know it. Thank you. Ma'am, James said, his voice catching a little. He looked up at the sky, the last light of the day fading into dusk. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, about building something better, step by step, day by day. That night, after dinner, James sat at the small table his siblings gathered around as he showed them. The notebook explaining the sketches and notes. David was sitting closest, his eyes wide with admiration. One day I'll be just like you, James, David said, his voice full of awe. James smiled, ruffling his brother's hair. You'll be even better, David. We're all going to be better. You'll see. The room was filled with warmth, with hope. His mother watched from the kitchen, her heart swelling with pride as she saw her children gathered together, their eyes bright with the promise of a better future, and as the candlelight flickered, casting soft shadows across the room. James knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead was still long, and there would be challenges, more hard days, more obstacles, but James also knew that he was ready. He had his family, he had Mr. Roberto, and most importantly, he had a dream. And that dream, nurtured by kindness, hope, and the strength to keep going, would carry them all forward. James looked at the tattered notebook, at the sketches and plans, and felt determination rise within him. One day. He would teach others one day, he would pass on what he had learned, and one day the small acts of kindness. The small steps forward would add up to something greater than he could ever imagine. And for now, that was more than enough.